Hello, I'm Kathy Kelly, editor of books at the Omohundro Institute. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this afternoon's OI Author Conversation. This is a newish program for us, one that allows scholars to talk about their work, and just as important, to talk about the processes that undergird their work, the thinking, the researching, and the writing. Today's program, Fighting for Their Places, Race and Settlement in the Early Republic, takes a look at new approaches to westward expansion, one of the central themes in early US history. Before I introduce our guests, I do want to take a moment to share the land acknowledgement of William and Mary, our founding donor. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the lands our campus is on today: the Cherowanhaka, Nottoway, the Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, Pamunkey, Potawatomi, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes. And we pay our respects to their tribal members, past and present. We offer this acknowledgement at all of our public programs, but I admit that it seems especially pertinent for today's conversation, given the important work that Samantha, Seeley, and Michael Witkin have both done to center the experiences of Indigenous and Black Americans in our understanding of American history. I'd like to take a moment now to introduce them both. Samantha Seeley is assistant professor of history at the University of Richmond. Her first book, Race, Removal, and the Right to Remain: Migration and the Making of the United States, will be out in fall 2021, published by the Omohundro Institute. Advance praise for the book congratulated Samantha for, quote, making us see the long era of removal in a new way, and for, quote, offering a revolutionary model for telling all of our stories together. Michael Witkin is professor of history at the University of Michigan. Next fall, he'll be moving to Columbia, where he'll be a professor in the Department of History and the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity. His current book project, Seeing Red: Indigenous Land, American Expansion, and the Political Economy of Plunder in North America, was described by an early reviewer as brilliant and engrossing. That reviewer predicted that Michael's analysis of what he calls the political economy of plunder will transform our view of settler colonialism. Seeing Red will also be published by the Omohundro Institute of fall 2021. I'd like to offer one final note before we begin today. We've saved a bit of time at the end for questions. The easiest way with a group this size to manage those is for you simply to enter them into the chat box as we move along. We can monitor them there, and we'll be able to pick them up at the end and sort through them. Thank you very much. Okay, let's get started. I want to begin, Michael and Samantha, and thank you again so much for taking the time to join us today. This is really terrific. I want to start with the question of movement and migration, an issue that's foregrounded in Samantha's title, obviously, but it's central to Michael's account as well. So much of the received notions that we have about mobility in the US is unidirectional. Enslaved and free Blacks want to move north to freedom. Whites want to march west across the continent in order to acquire land. Native peoples, in turn, are pushed further and further and further west in their way. But both of you wind up telling far more complicated stories about how people wanted to move, whether they wanted to remain, whether or not they were able to achieve the kinds of outcomes that they wanted, the kinds of outcomes that they wanted. I'm interested in hearing each of you say a bit about how you came to your stories and what made you want to tell them. I don't know, Samantha, do you want to go first here?
Sure, I can take a stab at that question. Thank you, Kathy. So I started this project when I was still a graduate student. It began as a dissertation when I followed a footnote from Elizabeth Barron's Tisunian to a set of petitions that free Black Virginians submitted to the state legislature in the early 19th century, asserting their right to remain in the state. And those petitions came out of this law that was passed in Virginia in 1806 that required them to leave within 1 year of manumission or emancipation. And it occurred to me reading those petitions, which were these really kind of detailed explanations of why they were deserving of the right to remain and wanted to stay in Virginia, a slave state. It occurred to me that what most people wanted was actually not the power to move, but the power to remain. And what I think is, still this sort of persistent idea of the, early United States is this idea of free movement, as Kathy was sort of explaining to us. It's there at the very beginning of the profession itself, and I think it persists in a lot of the kind of public understanding of the period. And so the main kind of idea of the book was really to push back on that idea that free movement was what people wanted. Actually people wanted, the power to basically be left alone and to stay in place. And this is where I think, the power of comparison was really helpful to me, which was, obviously this idea of remaining is really important and central to Native American and Indigenous studies. It's not quite as central to African American studies in the same period. And so kind of putting these two fields next to each other allowed me to see that a little bit better.
Michael?
I think I came to this project because of my first book, which kind of ends in the early period of the early Republic. And that kind of ended with the premise that the Great Lakes in particular was always sort of the illusion of empire for the French, for the British. And when the Americans showed up, they inherited that same sort of illusion of empire, but you had a couple of different forts and essentially an indigenous population. So I kind of started out with that as a sort of starting point. And then also, I think, like Samantha, thinking about how sort of the master narratives work in American history, one of the things that always bothered me was that so much of the master narrative that you get in high school or AP classes or even in survey classes at colleges sort of had the revolution, had the 7 Years' War, had the revolution, moments where natives matter. Then post-revolution, there's sort of a big event and it's removal. And then Indians sort of disappear. And, for the upper Midwest, for the Great Lakes, that's not the case. Native people are so demographically dominant that I wanted to tell that story. What happens to the Native people who don't get removed, who actually end up having an important role in how the Republic deals with questions like race or belonging for people of color. And so I started, looking at this, and I in particular started looking at voting rights cases. And the thing that struck me immediately was that the subtext of all these voting rights cases wasn't really about whether or not mixed race Native people should have a particular privilege or not. It was about whether or not granting them those privileges would have an impact on what you had to grant African American people, free Black people in the upper Midwest. And you couldn't, no jurist seemed to be able to talk about the rights and status of mixed race Native people without simultaneously talking about what any determination would mean for the rights and status of free Blacks moving into the Northwest Territories.
Yeah, I do think that that's one of the really compelling things about each of your projects is the way that you braid together in various ways the stories of Indigenous and African descended peoples in North America. One of the things that I've told many people when talking about each of your projects is that there was always that moment when we were teaching the early Republic in a graduate seminar, when one of the students in the seminar would ask, why was it that the question of movement with African American, African descended peoples, and the question of removal, why were these things never pulled together into a single frame of reference? And so each of you have managed to do that in ways that I think are really productive. And you've done so, it seems to me, both of you, in ways that are really pretty place-bound. Samantha, you talk about how do you define the area that you talk about? The middle? The
middle states, which I gather from talking to someone who specializes in maps, isn't a super common way that people referred to the area, but it's the way that Matthew Carey referred to it when on his own map of what he called the middle states. So it's the states that bordered the Ohio River and then eastward. So Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois.
And Michael, your work focuses on the area north of, you want to say more about that?
Yeah, so I'm looking at the Northwest Territories and essentially the shaping of those territories into Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin. And the thing that was striking for me is, you look at a story like the story of Ohio, which never even has to go through a territorial period. The population becomes so dense that in 1803, it goes straight to statehood. And Indiana and Illinois make similar trajectories where they become territories and then move into states. The 60,000 free white person population is met, and they quickly enter the Union. But Michigan, in contrast, doesn't become a state until 1837. So it's that long trajectory, and it doesn't become a state because, unlike Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, it's not connected to the Mississippi through Ohio and the Wabash Rivers, and therefore it's not connected to sort of the market economy of the U.S. Until the Erie Canal. So that left Michigan with this sort of Indian majority territory, well into almost up to the edge of the Civil War. So I was kind of thinking that has to have an important way of shaping how we think about the early republic. What do you do with the state that has this really dominant Indian population? What is a country that's defining itself increasingly along the color line in terms of citizenship and privileges? What does that mean? So I definitely was focused on the Northwest Territories, but specifically the northern tier.
You know, this is probably about as good as any, as good a place as any to get out on the table what the implications of that are, and you put that right in the title of the book. You call it the political economy of plunder. It's a wonderfully evocative phrase, but it probably is one that wants a little bit of unpacking and defining just as we move through the discussion today.
So one of the things that came to me was, so if you look at in the book, I also used the Jefferson Hartley Map, which probably most people are familiar with. It's that map that Jefferson made to go with the land law that he wrote in 1794 that preceded the Northwest Ordinance, and it envisions the Northwest Territory as like 14 states, and it's a map that sort of erases the presence of Indians, and of course on the ground that's not the case. And the thing that makes a place like Michigan so significant is that actually, while the U.S. has this sort of aspirational settler colonial ideology, in places like Michigan, it's not actually a settler colonial power. It actually functions much more like a colonial power. And it ends up being that in a place like Michigan or Wisconsin, the money isn't made from dispossessing Indians and removing them, eliminating them, but rather from dispossessing Native peoples and then sort of entering into this ongoing relationship with them as subject powers that were continually extracting money. And the political economy plunder, for example, is this series of treaties that are made that make, let's say, a place like Michigan. Michigan is comprised and is entirely native title when it's created as a territory in 1805. And by 1837, it's gone through 12 different treaties that have ceded the entirety of the state. The last of these major cessions is in 1836, when 13 million acres are ceded to the federal government. And the annuity payment for that, the payment that the US government promises to give to Ojibwe and Odawa and Potawatomi people for that land cession, which was equivalent of 7 cents per acre, that put that first payment of $30,000. Out of that first payment, when the federal government shows up with hard cash currency to pay the Indian people, 27,726 of that money, of that 30,000, is claimed by traders as debt. And so really $2,274 goes to the entire Ojibwe and Odawa peoples who signed that treaty, which is a pittance. On top of that, the same people who claim that debt, the traders, have $10,000 provisions or in addition to the cash annuity. Well, the federal government buys those provisions to give to the Indians from those same traders that have just claimed the debt. And then they get a third dipping of this because they also provide provisions for the usually week-long treaty dispersal, where they're feeding the parties who have come to the treaty. So on 3 different occasions, they're sort of making money off Native people, and very little money is getting to the indigenous signers of that treaty. And this in effect becomes this sort of cash economy of places like Michigan, this kind of Indian business, the business of doing business with Indians. And so it struck me as a plunder economy. It's basically land theft compounded by this sort of actual theft of wealth and compensation for that land theft. And that's what the business of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota was in the mid-19th century.
Yeah, I mean, it's a striking account of plunder. And one of the things that I remember being so struck by the book, but also by the JER article, Journal of the Early Republic article that preceded it, is that it's a way in which it does set up a situation in which white settlers in the U.S. government make money no matter what. It's a game system, or it seems that way, for want of a better way to put it. I want to move a little bit forward and talk about something more process oriented. One of the things that jumps out in both of your work, even from the amount that we've talked about it today, is the way that you center Indigenous and Black actors in your narratives, and you show how Black and Indigenous people really do figure pivotally in critical moments in the history of expansion. And those people aren't just responding to the actions of the US government. They aren't simply reactionary. I'm wondering if you would each share something about the kinds of archival strategies that you used to find and to foreground people who have for so long been overlooked in our master narratives, as we called them earlier, in US history. Was it a question of finding new evidence, or was it a matter simply of reading old evidence differently? And this is a question that students and graduate students very often want to talk about, right? Are we looking for, do we need a new archive, or do we just need to do new things with our older archive? Samantha?
Yeah, so I mean, I should say, first of all, that the book is really looking at removal in all of these kind of different contexts in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. So I'm looking at colonization and treaties and restrictive migration laws, planned buffer states, all of these ways that white legislators and planners and thinkers, writers were kind of thinking about solving what they saw as the major debates that were left behind after the American Revolution. So debates about the kind of about slavery and emancipation, about land, about war debts, etc. One of the kind of challenges of writing about those topics is that a lot of them have been written about before by a vast array of scholars. And so I just want to begin by acknowledging the kind of depth of work in the field. And all of the many scholars that I had the privilege of learning from as I tried to write about these topics and bring them together. I think what I always wanted to do was to bring the fields into conversation with each other and to see what could be found and discovered through the task of comparison. So kind of respecting the boundaries and terms of these really different fields, but then also allowing them to speak to each other a little bit. So that's just the first thing that I'll say about finding new archives versus using old ones. I feel like I'm looking at sources that people have looked at before in a lot of cases. And then I think the second part of Kathy's question was about the actions of Native and Black actors. Did I get that right, Kathy? So, the other part of the book, it's not just about the kind of removal plans and ambitions of state legislators or federal officials. It's also really about how people push back against those plans on the ground. And I always wanted to keep that kind of social historical dimension as well as the more like top-down political dimension, and to think about state making as the interplay of both of those things. So just to give one example, in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, which always really interested me sort of for the reasons that Michael was gesturing towards before, which is that land theft proceeds so rapidly there in the early 19th century, in the late 18th and early 19th century. But those states also are passing restrictive migration laws against free African Americans at the same time. And so they're really trying to determine the boundaries of citizenship in their state, the boundaries of settlement along racial lines. And they're imagining these as kind of free states, but free states that will privilege white freedom over Black freedom. At the same time, Black Americans don't necessarily abide by those laws that are on the books that are trying to keep them out, and they go anyways. And they are creating really significant kind of centers of Black freedom in those Midwestern states at the time. So free Black towns that will, be kind of these like sort of autonomous centers of for emancipated people. And so, I always wanted to keep that kind of interplay between what legislators, what their ambitions were, and then what's actually happening on the ground, which is that people determine what states are just as much as those legislators and planners did.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really terrific things. That's one of the really terrific things about your work is that it isn't, it's definitely a study in which DC matters, but it's not a DC centric study by any stretch of the imagination. And you show, if I can just push a little bit more or get you to talk a little bit more about this, one of the things that I found so exciting about your work is the multiple different kinds of places that African descended people think about going. And, you know, there's the colonization movement and the African American consideration of that. But then there's also, you know, the folks in Virginia who don't want to leave Virginia at all. That it's a really there are multiple paths forward that people might be interested in taking.
Yeah, I think you know, that's the kind of third piece, which is always, you know, not only are people embracing this idea of a movement towards freedom, which I think we see in a lot of the literature as a really important theme and an important reality for people, you know, to embrace freedom. People often had to leave slave states, whether by, you know, by force or by choice. And in this case, in Virginia, there are these several, you know, 100 petitions from the period before 1830 explaining why people wanted to remain in place and why that was important to them. And so, you know, they're kind of calling on the idea of community and family and the connections that makes them able to secure their livelihoods and freedom. So the kind of patronage connections that make them able to secure their livelihoods where they are. And that's certainly something that I saw in the Ohio Valley as well.
Michael?
Yeah, I think I went down this path because I was looking at court cases. I said I was looking at voting rights cases, and what was happening was that you were finding that the voting rights case, the concern really wasn't, you know, I was starting out thinking about, well, you've got all these mixed race people who are who sort of emerged out of the fur trade, and how are they navigating citizenship in the Republic? How are they navigating whether or not they're qualified or not? And what was fascinating is that it was the cases, particularly the dissenting opinions and things like that, where people were what they were really concerned about wasn't really the acceptance or integration of mixed race Native people, but what accepting or granting privileges to mixed race Native people meant for their what they would have to grant or recognize for free Black people moving into the upper Midwest. And so the thing that was fascinating was that the anti-Black racism was at the heart of all this case law. It wasn't so much anti-Indigenous racism, it was anti-Black racism. That's what they were concerned with. Do we have to if we let this mixed race person vote in Ohio, do we have to then start allowing Black children to go to public schools? I mean, that's literally the arguments they were having. So I was finding my way to this by just reading the case law back and forth. And that kind of took me into looking at state constitutions and constitutional conventions, like what are they doing there? And there I found the same conversation over and over again, that what do we do with this large, particularly mixed race Native population? And the answer to that question was invariably, what does that mean for what we have to do with the free Black population, which we want to limit? Because that also leads you then to the anti-Black laws that are in places like Ohio and Michigan, where you have to have a certificate proving you're free, post a $500 bond with the county clerk in the county that you live in. There are penalties if you hire somebody and you haven't made sure that they've secured that certificate. You can hire that person will be penalized. So it could penalize people, make them less interested in hiring free Black labor. So I was unaware of these connections, and I was fascinated by it. And it was going down this road, looking at this case law that drove me to it. I would also say when I was first doing this research was in the middle of when Ferguson was on fire, and so for me that was kind of an aha moment of like, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing anti-Black racism is not a bug in the system of the Republic, it's a feature of the system. And it's when over policing that you're seeing in the territorial period, you're seeing over policing in Ferguson in the 21st century. So not only seeing those connections, but then, facing the fact that this is how the system is meant to work. And conversely, the Indian side of this, the federal government's always been super interested in keeping tabs of Native people and also trying to decide how Indian they really are. And so those records are also pretty easily available. And one of the provisions of all the treaties that they end up making Michigan and Wisconsin and Ohio are they have provisions for mixed race people. First, they're giving land grants, and they're giving money. And there's usually at the Clements, there's this collection called the half-breed claims. It's a collection of half-breed claims for in particular, the 1837 Treaty of St. Peter's, which had a really large annuity for mixed-race people. And to get that annuity, you had to go present yourself to Lucius Lyon, who's the senator of Michigan, and basically tell them your family history. So they're little ethnographic collections of mixed-race families throughout, indigenous and mixed-race families throughout the Midwest. Which is a phenomenal question. And I hadn't seen a whole lot of people have not worked with this collection. It's not been digitized or anything, but it's super accessible, it's super easy to use. But I hadn't seen a lot of people working with that. So for me, that was kind of the case law stuff was not particularly new, but this collection of essentially ethnography that's in the Clements was a bounty for this project.
I didn't know that. I've learned new things about this project that I did not know before. One of the implications of using the kinds of archives that you've used, new archives and old archives used in new ways, that was implicit in what you were both just talking about, has to do with how your work changes a lot of the things that we think about. A lot of the ways that we think about chronology. So, Michael, you just mentioned that you were reading these cases thinking about Ferguson and events that are still very much with us today. Samantha, your book on removal in the early U.S. Republic begins in the colonial period. You really do reframe how we think about the period of removal. If you want to say a little bit more about that part of your work, Samantha, I'd be interested in hearing the two of you talk more about what you think happens when we stretch out this era of removal from where historians typically tend to put it, at least where it typically is in the textbooks that I've used when I've taught US history, and you begin in the colonial era and we talk about the implications of removal extending all the way into now. Samantha?
So, well, just on the chronology of the book. So, I think that the term removal is usually associated with the antebellum period. The book is really mapping out the antecedents to that conversation. So it's really mapping out the kind of public debate around removal, as well as the enactment of removal policies between the 1770s and the 1830s, with beginning chapter that is, Kathy says, moves back into the colonial period. And so the project really ends where a lot of studies of removal begin, with the 1830s. So the final kind of chapter charts how Indian removal and colonization come together in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois in the 18 teens and 1820s. So by the 1830s, when the book concludes, I think it's really obvious to see how these stories come together, because activists are saying that they're coming together. Removal was one of the most hotly debated issues at the time. Reformers are starting to connect those movements in print. But what I'm trying to do is to show that term was in use before, as well as many of the major kind of moves that and ideas that people are embracing by the 1830s. They were already present at the very beginning of the Republic itself. And that's not to say that removal, like the Indian Removal Act of 1830, for example, is an inevitability. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that the groundwork was laid beforehand, that those ideas and ambitions were there, even if the kind of ability to achieve them was not. But this idea of creating a white republic was present from the very beginnings of the nation itself.
Yeah. So can I ask you both just to speculate even wildly about what it means to pull those chronological parameters, to stretch them out in the way that you do? Are you open to doing that?
I am. I guess my project, I think that I think too often, as you said, removal sort of frames how we think about this early Republic period, and we sort of exit Indians from stage left. And they not only do they not get removed in places like Michigan, Wisconsin. But like I said, the business of treating with Indians is how Wisconsin and Michigan get made. The infrastructure, the money that comes into the state gets made. 11 treaties between 1805 and 1836 extinguished the title of the entirety of that state. Indian peoples don't go away. They're not only are they not removed, but by the time you get to the mid to late 30s, you actually have the people in those territories, Wisconsin and Michigan, they don't want the Indians removed. They want them there because they see them as a source of cash. So there's actually pushback against the federal government's desire to remove Native peoples from the non-Native peoples on the ground in places like Michigan and Wisconsin. And the other thing that's going on is those people who are kind of the architects of this, both dispossession and then the sort of plunder economy that I talked about before, those are often people who are mixed race or intermarried with Native people, have Native children. So they're also kind of doing it to themselves, which is another astounding thing. But it definitely, I think the other thing for me is that it reframes the story of American expansion, not as this sort of post-colonial thing, but as actually an ongoing act of colonization. What's happening to the Anishinaabe in Michigan and Wisconsin is colonization. They're being colonized. And the wealth is being extracted from them in like a classic colonial fashion by the metropole. And that's what the business of Michigan is. It's extracting wealth from Native people. And and it doesn't just happen in the moment of the treaties. You know, the 1837 Treaty of Wisconsin that we talked about in the book, most of that, or a huge portion of that land ceded in that treaty, 11 million acres in central Wisconsin, that ends up being switched to public domain, which is then given by the federal government back to the states as part of the land grant process. They give land scripts. And the pioneries of Michigan created in the 1837 treaty, there's not a desire for that land when that title is extinguished, and it sits in public domain and then gets given back to the U.S. and becomes the financial basis for land grant universities in the U.S. So indigenous wealth is sort of permeates the sort of the infrastructural development of America, the financial development of America, the development of American institutions like public universities. So I think if you stretch it that way, it looks like a big colonial history as opposed to sort of a traditional way. I think that I at least got history when I was in undergraduate and high school was a kind of, there's colonialism, then there's a revolution, and then after that, there's something else.
Does that resonate with you, Samantha? You're nodding over there.
Yeah, enthusiastically. Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things that Michael's work really makes me think about is the difference between, again, like ambitions and then what's actually happening, because removal is always a contest and it's not an inevitability. And so people are pushing back against it in all different ways. And that includes the white neighbors of people who are purportedly going to be removed. So, you know, a different example in the South would be like in Virginia, those people who are supposed to be removed with the 1806 law, their neighbors don't necessarily want to see them go. Their white neighbors don't necessarily want to see them go. And so they're helping them in their efforts to petition the state legislature for the power to remain. So you kind of see everywhere that this is always a contest, that, you know, removal, people might think about that on a broad scale really differently than how they think when it's about their own neighborhood.
Good. I want to throw out just one more sort of really big question, because the chat queue is filling up, and I want to make sure that we get time to deal with people's questions and maybe even get some back and forth going here. Talking about your projects, actually with my husband the other night, he's made the comment that it sounded as though what each of you were doing was turning sort of a set piece, a series of assumptions about early U.S. history on their heads. And I think that, you know, that's true. And at the same time, your studies are both pretty bounded. Samantha, you're looking at the Middle States. Michael, you're looking at Michigan, Wisconsin, the Old Northwest. I'd love to hear you each say more about how the kinds of processes that you've talked about, often very surprising processes, often very surprising outcomes, change our understanding of vast early America. And maybe just as important, clarify exactly what you think the implications of your work are for the history of the US. If you had to because we're on the verge of baseball season, if you had to take a bat and swing for the fences, what's the big historiographic payoff, and how do you think that textbooks might be rewritten to account for the kinds of work that you're doing? This is your chance to climb up on a soapbox.
Maybe I'll let Michael be on the soapbox first.
Um, I think it would, if I was going to be on that soapbox, I would be, I, it kind of started off when I was starting this project off. My friend Rachel St. John was visiting her grandmother in Michigan. She was driving between Ann Arbor and Saginaw, and she said, how do you not feel pissed off when you drive through Michigan and you just look what they've done with this land? And I'm like, yeah, it does kind of make me feel pissed off. And I was starting with that kind of realization, because I was also beginning to look at these treaties and realizing how fast and how profound the dispossession is, how an entire state, and the amount of cash that the amount of wealth that's extracted from Native people is foundational to the creation of America. The expansion of America wouldn't be possible without that wealth extraction. As I said, up to the point even into the late 19th and 20th century, when that wealth is being used to create a public university system. This is kind of pointing back toward what Samantha was saying about none of this stuff is inevitable. Removal is not inevitable. The exclusion of Black citizens, or attempts to exclude Black citizens from places like Ohio, Michigan, is inevitable. These are all self-conscious choices that are being made as part of this larger colonial process that the U.S. is engaged in. And I think the extent to which America is made possible by the plundering of indigenous wealth and the suppression of Black rights is profound. And I think these projects kind of show that this isn't a discrete thing that happens. It's a fundamental to the system. It's the system being engaged. People were having to work at this. They're having to work at the anti-Black exclusion. They're having to work at this dispossession. They're having to really, this is a conscious choice that's being made time and time again. And like I mentioned, Ferguson and Standing Rock were happening at the time I was working on this project. And I wrote about that in the epilogue. And then between when I turned my manuscript in and when I got to revise it again, there were how many more Black people killed by police officers in that time period that I originally wrote about Ferguson. And I couldn't even get a redraft without multiple other deaths happening in the same thing. So I think just understanding the extent to which this is built into the historical development of the United States, this sort of racism and colonialism. So I guess that's my soapbox moment, I guess.
It's a great soapbox. Samantha?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I also hope that the book kind of addresses those questions of, what were the consequences of the American Revolution. That, I think the book is really trying to show that the project of creating a kind of white republic was there from the beginning, and that, if these problems about who has the ability to occupy public space safely persist, it's because they were there in the beginning. It's present in the design of the republic. And so that's one thing, is really kind of an intervention about race and whiteness. And then the other one is about, again, kind of flipping the script on that really persistent, pernicious, enduring question of movement and of free movement as one of the defining themes of the early national period. And so trying to say, instead, the experience for many people was that they hoped to stay in place and just be left alone. And they couldn't do that because of these really kind of persistent projects of removal that endured into the 19th century in much more devastating forms by the 1830s.
Okay, thank you. Chat is kind of blowing up, and so I'm going to start picking my way through the chat. There are a number of questions actually that have to do with terminology and have to do with how we talk about and think about Indigenous peoples. What do we talk about? How do we use Indigenous versus specific tribal names? Whether or not First Peoples, Aboriginals are more appropriate. Why could you each just weigh in on how you yourself work through the choices about whether to refer to Anishinaabe, whether you wanted to talk about Indigenous peoples, Native, Indian, all of those terms have figured, I think, in our discussion today at some point. How do you think about what terms to use and how and why in your writing?
I'll go quick. So I, for the most part, I try to use terms that Native people are using for themselves. having said that, that's also tricky, being Anishinaabe, you can also be Ojibwe or Dawa, Potawatomi. So I usually try to use those terms and use them as I find them in the text. But I also use the term Indian a lot because Indian was a sort of racialized category of identity in the early republic. It was being used as that. So I don't use that myself in the sense of using it, but I'll use it where it's in the text. And I'll sometimes explain that people are using that. They're using that purposely because American Indian means a thing about race, about non-citizenship, about all kinds of things to somebody like Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. And similarly, when you, like a lot of the things I got were these like half-breed petitions where mixed race people were petitioning for or asserting their rights as citizens, but also trying to use that terminology of half-breed to assert their indigenous identity as well. So that is clearly not a term I would use, but when it shows up in the text, I'll explain that this is Indian and half-breeds are these categories that have meaning, social meaning at this time period. And I usually try to do that, historicize how I'm using it. Otherwise, generically, when I'm talking about it, I usually use the term native or indigenous, or I use the national self-identity.
Yeah, I mean, same on that, the last point, to try to use the kind of specific language when I can. And then, there is a particular political formation of the United Indian Nations, which is a term that comes out of the sources, although other scholars have used different terms. And so, I often use that umbrella term when I'm talking about the particular political goals of that, of that formation in the 1790s in the Ohio Valley.
Okay, I'm going to start running through some of the questions in the chat box just because we're, time's going to go. Emily Connolly has a question for both Michael, but also Samantha. And the question, I'm not going to read the whole thing, although she's thrilled to see both of your books come out. She's interested, Michael, in whether you see Indigenous actors strategizing around annuities. In other words, whether you see there are ways that Native people were able to wrest back control over their wealth, channel annuities toward their own purposes, or do you only see annuities as a sort of a negative force for Indigenous sovereignty? And Samantha, that may very well speak to your work as well.
I don't see Indigenous people being able to take advantage of annuities. I mean, they are literally, like I said, the first annuity for the 1836 treaty in Michigan, the first payout of $30,000, $27,000 plus is claimed by traders. But I say that also knowing that most of those traders are intermarried. Some of them are mixed race. Some of them are, or if they're not, they're intermarried with Native people. So they're also, the annuities become a way for the people in the fur trade, mixed race and people adjacent to Native peoples. It's how they're cashing out of the fur trade. They're literally, the fur trade is coming to an end. They see settlement as bringing it into that business model. And so they're kind of cashing out. So I don't see it as being something that works to the benefit of Native peoples, that so little money gets to them. And really where Native peoples would be in a radically different place today would have been if they would have been able to maintain their one main asset, which was land value. It had I was thinking about the land scripts that go to fund the land grant colleges. That land was purchased at 7 cents an acre, and some of those land grant universities were able to take those land scripts and sell those plots of land for as high as $80 an acre. Imagine making the profit, from 7 cents to $80. If Native peoples had been able to hold on to that asset, the communities would be radically different today. So, I mean, I think in that sense, I don't see annuities as anything other than a form of theft that happened. I think of treaties as a form of theft, and the only sort of redeeming value is that those treaties also ultimately left the mechanisms in place for people to reclaim sovereignty, or I shouldn't say reclaim it, to start reasserting their sovereignty.
I mean, I suspect that Emily knows much more about annuities in the period that I'm working on than I do, because I know that she specializes in this topic. But I would say that I'm really surprised at how early those annuities become mechanisms to kind of, there are mechanisms to dock them basically over the supposed theft of a horse or something similar. I'm just really surprised at how early that happens, how early they're seen as just another way of stealing Native resources and money.
Samantha, this is a question to you from Karima Lewis. She wonders if you could discuss the legislative response to those several hundred petitions that were submitted to remain in Virginia. And she wonders how you incorporate the African-American push back to relocation to Africa by the American Colonization Society.
Yeah, so first of all, the legislative response, the legislative petitions tend to be rejected in Virginia or laid on the table, although there are, many that are kind of accepted and people gain the full legal right to remain in Virginia. Then in 1815, there's a law that's put on the books that allows people to go to the county courts. And those county court petitions to remain are much more successful. And again, I think this points at something that Michael was gesturing towards earlier, which is that often when it comes to what's actually happening on the ground and communities, people don't necessarily want to see African Americans in this case leave. They're their neighbors. In terms of incorporating the ACS, so I started with the idea of looking at the kind of early roots of colonization before 1816, because I think the ACS, with its kind of vast mouthpiece and archive, really overshadows the idea of colonization in general. And so I wanted to show that it's this much longer idea that goes off in many different directions. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do is show that there's continuity between colonizationist ideas, which really start in the 1770s, in this moment when emancipation is on the table in a much different kind of way than it had been. It starts then in the 1770s, and it continues as an idea, but it also continues in practice. So this Virginia law, for example, I think is an expression in the law of colonizationist ideas. It seems from the legislative records to have come out of a push for colonization in Petersburg, Virginia, which is a center of free Black life in the period. And it seems like it's a kind of direct response by this push by the town leaders in Petersburg, Virginia, to expel free African Americans from the state. So I think these things they're really linked, is what I was kind of trying to show, that even before the ACS, these ideas are put into practice. They're not just, it's not just kind of like ideas floating up here, but they also have real consequences for people.
Okay. A rejoinder, perhaps, from Ed Countryman, who pointed out, and it would be great to have you respond to this, in terms of the so-called master narrative of masters and mastery, there just seems to him to be the need of absolutely recognizing that the Republic was an empire from the get-go. Like slavery challenged, but simultaneously strengthened in the early Republic, this is an inheritance from earlier colonialism. Discuss.
Yes. Yes, Ed, I agree. Yeah, I think settler colonialism has been a big splash in native studies, native history, and so in that sense, for me, what was more fascinating with looking at this is the extent to which the U.S. aspirationally wants to be a settler colonial power, but at least in places like the Upper Midwest, it's not. It's forced to be a colonial power, just straight up colonization, and it requires the sort of hard work of colonization, of extracting that wealth, of subjecting that population, the indigenous population. So, yeah, I agree.
Yeah, so this is one of the reasons why I have that first chapter in the book that kind of pushes removal back even further to say, we could start this story in with the foundation of the U.S. Because I think that there's something about the formation of the U.S. that kind of accelerates these ideas and makes them more prominent, and they're kind of like in the fabric of the United States from its beginning. But they have antecedents too.
Another question, and I'm apologizing in advance because there's some dachshund noise in the background, or like everybody else, I'm working from home, and like some of us, I have dogs. So this is a question from Marin Odo, and thinks it's perhaps more a question for Samantha. She's interested in whether you could say more about concrete strategies that your actors use to make claims to the spaces where they want to stay, not just, in other words, the legal moves of petitions, but actual markers on the landscape. She's thinking, for example, of ways that settlers describe parts of Kentucky as the empty quarter, which of course isn't empty at all, but how to how do settlers and indigenous people describe and define the concrete evidence of native claims to the land? And I'm going to mute myself and
So yeah, I think that this is something that comes up in a part of a chapter that I did on the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, where the conversation is all about this huge cession that's forced upon the United Indian Nations that constitutes most of Ohio. And you know, the kind of native leaders at that treaty are trying to say very specifically, you can see the marks of our houses everywhere on the land. We have kind of rights to this land that come from occupation and use over time, and you can see that on the landscape. And so it's all about the treaty itself is all about how to make claims to land, and then ultimately how to draw a kind of border that will separate people, and that will be a permanent border. And of course, what happens with that treaty is that it's not permanent at all, despite the kind of vast promises of the officials who are running the treaty, that within just a few years, the federal government is coming back for more land.
I would tack onto that and say that, like, looking at the records for the Army of the Northwest under Harmer, the correspondence between him and his officers who are out there essentially trying to evict squatters from settling before the Northwest Ordinance comes into place. These people are writing back and forth about writing about Ohio as being a state of nature, even as they're interacting with Native peoples who have, as Susan Smith showed, really prosperous villages and houses and things like that. So they're seeing indigenous wealth, indigenous prosperity, and then they're still in their correspondence calling this a state of nature. And kind of basically his soldiers saying, boy, I don't blame these guys for coming out and claiming their piece of the state of nature. I would like to do it too. So they're both seeing the reality of Native people on the ground and then acting like they don't see it.
Yeah, Susan Sleeper Smith's book was so important for me for making that point. And I'll say that the kind of flip side of that story is that squatters are doing the same thing. So white migrants who are going to the Ohio Valley in this period are trying to build homes or cabins as fast as possible to stake their own claims to land. And so those kind of eviction records are all about burning down those cabins and destroying them so that they can't claim the land themselves.
Yeah, that sounds exactly right. And we have another question. This is from Adrian Stockwell, and she would like Michael to elaborate a bit on his concept of the plunder economy. To what extent or to what degree do historians acknowledge that Native people's financial and economic expertise tried to mitigate the economic onslaught?
I don't think that they do. The latest example that I just gave is just the land-grant university system is funded through the public domain being given to states. The public domain is created through this treaty process that systematically dispossessed Native people. I read a book from the 1980s when I was doing research on the air quotes land system, the land system of the United States from Jackson to Lincoln. And it was entirely a discussion about the sort of importance of public land, free soil movement, not a single word about treaties or the transfer of that land from indigenous title to public domain, not a single word. So I think by and large, I think people are doing what those soldiers were doing in the Ohio. They're pretending like they're not seeing where this land is coming from. So I don't see that in terms of the plunder. Another prime example of the plunder economy is something that happens in 1851 or 52, where merchants and territorial officials in Minnesota try to force Wisconsin Ojibways to come take their annuity in Minnesota because they want to trick them into being in Minnesota state permanently, because that's where they'll make money off them. It ends up in being an event called the Wisconsin Death March that ends up killing 400 Ojibways. So more Ojibwe died in that event than, say, at Sand Creek Massacre. But this were people trying to engineer in the upper Midwest engineer ways to get more Indians into their state to get more money out of the Indians. So it definitely was this sort of systematic plunder.
You're welcome, Adrian Stockwell. I think that that is about all that we have time for. I would like to thank everyone for coming and for sharing my interest in Michael's and Samantha's work and putting up with my nutty dachshunds. Michael and Samantha, if you each want to say something in closing, I'm so grateful to you for making the time to come out today.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, Sam, thank you. I thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. And Kathy, thank you so much. You and the OI have been so pivotal for me getting this project done.